Verse 19, nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, but we will have a king over us. Notice the reason here in verse 20, really important. That we may also be like all the nations, that our king may judge us and go up before us and fight our battles. Israel's desire for a king, it was motivated by watching the nations around them. They had their eyes on everyone else, but they didn't have their eyes on God. Their desire was motivated by everything else around them. You see, God's desire was that they not be like other nations, but rather God wanted to make them unique, a special treasure. Exodus 19 says, God wanted to make them a special, he said, I want them to be a special treasure to me above all people. He wanted them to be a kingdom of priests, right? And a holy nation separated unto him. Here's what you and I do, and this is human nature, and sadly, we can do this even as Christians, but our natural tendency is to follow other people, is to imitate everyone else around us, to desire, what they have, to want to fit in like they fit in, to be accepted like they're accepted, and really to minimize all confrontation. For many people, that's how they want to live life. They just want to do what everyone else is doing, so they don't challenge the status quo. But the risk of being different, for you and I, it's often an adventure that requires faith. And we often do this in subtle ways. We imitate in subtle ways. We see everyone else doing something, and we think, wow, maybe I should do that too. We see everyone else moving there, and we think, gosh, maybe I should move there too. We have this natural tendency to say that we want to imitate and do what everyone else is doing. But just because everyone else is doing something right doesn't mean that it's right. I can think how many times growing in my faith that I was completely different, and I was, ridiculed and made fun of, and, was seen as the Christian guy or the holy roller. And sadly, because of that, people look at you and they say, wow, you're so different. You're so weird. You're so awkward. How could you follow God and not fit in? But you know what, though? There's not a single day, a single hour that I regret that. I don't regret a single hour of being different and walking with God. Because through all of that, and through the persecution, and through the risk of faith, this adventure of faith and walking with him, there's been an incredible peace along the way, knowing that you're walking in God's will. Romans 12 verses 1-2 says this, I beseech you, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. In verse 2, here's what I want you to think about and focus on. Do not be conformed to the world. Notice that word conform, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Do you desire to know God's will more? Do you desire to hear his voice? Don't be conformed. Lay down your life as a living sacrifice. As a child of God, for you and I, our eyes should be on God's word, not the ways of the world, like Israel, as they're focusing on other nations. And Samuel, in verse 21, heard all the words of the people, and he repeated them in the hearing of the Lord. Israel's not going to change their mind, but God will forewarn them, as we've seen. So the Lord said to Samuel, heed their voice and make them a king. And Samuel said to the men of Israel, every man go to his own city. That phrase, heed their voice, will be used 3 times in this chapter. God's desire was that they walk in obedience. But there comes a time in our life when God is telling you something over and over and over again, that sometimes he just allows you to walk in disobedience. And he allows you to bear the fruit of that disobedience in hopes that you and I would turn to him. Sometimes he allows you to walk and go astray and sin against him, just so you would see that his plan is much better.